siguiente expositora, que es Katherine Brittle. Ella representa South American New Opportunities Manager de Exxon Mobil. Va a tratar el tema de Outlook for Energy, una vista hacia el año 2040. Por favor, Katherine.
I apologize, I don't speak very much Spanish, so I'm going to do this in English. Today I'm going to present to you the outlook for energy. Now this is kind of a longer look at the energy profile from a global perspective. In the tiny text, the lawyers would like me to mention, it's difficult to see, that this is a forecast and things can change, politics change, supply and demand. It's based on an internal data as well as external data. So I'm happy to take you through all this. Make sure this goes. To do the energy outlook, we take a bottom-up approach. We look at over 100 different countries, country by country, sector by sector, and we consider all possible energy sources. As we look out to the year 2040, our focus is on what technologies and fuels best meet the needs of future consumers. Long-term planning is essential in the energy industry because projects span decades and they cost billions of dollars. Alone, ExxonMobil invested over $40 billion in 2013. In developing the outlook, we tap into a wide range of sources from our own scientists and university researchers to help us evaluate emerging technologies, to people in other industries such as auto companies, electric power providers, and we also engage with policymakers worldwide who are keen to exchange views with us on what makes sense for the future consumers and society. In the end, the outlook reveals the role energy will play in addressing challenges related to economic growth, industrial competitiveness, and energy security in the environment. While the outlook is unique to ExxonMobil, many of our views are in line with other major forecasters, including the International Energy Agency, or the IEA, and the U.S. Energy Information Administration. As we get into the outlook and talk about energy numbers, I have a chart that provides some perspectives on what are the energy measures and the units. I start by suggesting that we take an energy reference that hopefully everybody can relate to. It links back to our humans' first use of energy. So fire. We could say that the most basic unit is the amount of energy that is located in one log of wood. The energy contained in one log can be translated to our modern unit of energy, BTU. So one log contains 24,500 BTUs. A more familiar reference that we have is a gallon of gasoline. 1 gallon of gasoline contains the same energy as 5 logs. Now we know show electricity, which people see on their electrical bills in kilowatt hours. So 1 gallon of gasoline is equivalent to 36 kilowatt hours. It would take 13,000 AA batteries to hold this much energy, or 4,000 smartphone batteries. Now, we can roll this up into one person, to a global demand. So we note that not all people in the world use as much energy as they do within the US. In fact, if we look at a global average, we see that most people use about 1/4 of the energy that's currently used in the US. So not 34 logs, but only 9 logs. Or the equivalent of 1.7 gallons of gasoline. If you take into account, I'm going to go back one. If you take into account that the world, there's 7 people in the world, you can see that when you do simple math, there are 7 billion people in the world. Okay. So above what we can see here, we have the US daily capita. So you can see we use the equivalent of 7 logs per household use, 6 for personal transportation, 6 in commercial buildings, 4 commercial transportation so that we can get the goods that we use, and 11 for industrial in the US. That's the total of the 34. In the world, you can see there's the US. The world per capita is 9 logs or 1.7 gallons of gasoline. If we take those 7 billion people, we end up with a total equivalent of 12 billion gallons of gasoline per day that's used. So please remember, even though we come up with this very large number for global demand, it's driven by energy use per person, and it's lower and below the US, more developed global demand. So bear in mind that there's considerable pressure that this number will grow, not only because of population growth, but mainly because people in the world are seeking to upgrade their standards of living. This is what the most important theme is within the outlook. So let's start with a top-level summary, which answers the central question: how much energy will we need in the world? So we look at 2 different drivers of energy: population growth and economic activity. We expect that the population will grow to nearly 9 billion people. And if you look at the economic activity, global GDP is expected to expand by 140%. This is more than doubling. The economic development is important because the more energy will be needed to support this economic growth. And that means improved standards of living for billions of people. Now, if we look at the energy demand, ExxonMobil sees global energy demand rising by 35% in 2040. Note, however, there's a key insight. You can see that the energy demand is growing much slower than what the economic activity. How can this be possible? The answer is efficiency. The importance of efficiency in meeting global demand cannot be understated. The line shows how much more money is needed in order to, if we did not expect future improvements in how efficiently we use energy. And this is across the board, in essentially all sectors. So we need more efficient cars, we need efficient light bulbs, appliances, and industrial processes. As this line shows, the world will save a lot of energy this way, and you can even say efficiency is actually the largest source of energy for the future. To examine the trends more quickly, the outlook breaks the world into 5 groups. The first is the member of the OECD nations. This includes things like the US and Europe. These are the places where economies and energy systems are the most developed. Then we have China and India. And the next group is a group of 10 countries we refer to as key growth because of their projected strong gains in population, GDP, and energy demand. These 10 that you'll see within the presentation include Brazil, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Mexico, Nigeria, South Africa, Thailand, Egypt. Now with these slices you can see some rather dramatic trends. If you look at the bottom, the blue slice for the developed countries, you can see the growing economies, but they do have flat energy demand. This will be quite an accomplishment for these countries. Like the US, we need to continue to grow the economy, but use less energy. This also means that all of the growth that we see in energy demand is to support developing economies and improve living standards for the billions of people who live in these countries. Now let's look at what drives Latin America energy trends. It's important to understand the linkage between population growth, economic progress, and the amount and type of energy used in Latin America around the world. We have growing populations continue to advance economically and seek better living standards, which in general leads to increased energy use. Starting with the chart on the left, you can see that in 2010, Latin America population was roughly 475 million people. The average annual growth rate between 2010 and 2040 is expected to be 0.8%. At that rate, Latin American population is expected to have increased by more than 125 million people by 2040. The middle chart looks at the economic output from Latin America. It is measured by gross domestic product. The GDP is expected to increase at 3.2% per year. to 2040. Over the outlook period, Latin America's economy is expected to grow by more than 150% from 2010 levels. The right pane shows the forecast for Latin America's energy demand in BTUs. Demand is expected to grow significantly, by about 75% from 2010 to 2040. It's striking to note that Latin America's energy demand will grow at a much lower rate compared to its economic growth. This illustrates how Latin America will continue to grow in a much more energy efficient future. This chart shows the absolute dollar amount of GDP per capita in the year 2040 compared with 2010. It is shown with the dotted line. OECD countries continue to improve, and China is catching up, while India, key growth, and the rest of the world still lag behind in absolute level. At this point, I think it's important to point out that this is not just about GDP statistics. It's about people in their daily lives. Energy plays a big part here, as people seek to use more energy to improve their lives. Looking at the pictures, we have 2.7 billion people today have no access to modern cooking fuels. People everywhere want to benefit from modern machinery, and 1.3 billion people have no access to electricity. In this respect, it is truly a good news story as people lift themselves out of poverty to see the modern countries that we all consider essential. Here, we look at the global economic growth translates into higher living standards by looking at the size of the middle class and how it changes over time. The middle class here means that people are beyond a minimal income threshold, so they have more discretionary spending power. This puts them to reach products such as electrical appliances and cars, as well as services such as modern medicine and higher education. All of these improvements depend on energy. In addition, the rise in the middle class is not just about income. It is typically accompanied by other society-wide changes that also drive increased energy use, such as improved infrastructure, electrification, and urbanization. The middle class today is about 2 billion people, but it's expected to increase to nearly 5 billion by 2030. The next 15 years will represent a historic period of prosperity, the likes of which the world has never seen. The OECD today accounts for about half of the world's middle class population. The increase is almost all in the non-OECD. India adds 1.1 billion, and China adds another 0.9 billion. And these are the largest groups. The key growth countries double their numbers. These 12 countries represent over 80% of the growth in the global middle class, and these people will rely more heavily on modern energy to support their daily lives. If we look at Latin America's demographics, we see that over 65% of the population will be within the prime working age group from 2010 to 2040. The share of children decreases while the share of people 65 and older is going to grow. But the number of dependents per worker stays about the same. On the right, we show Latin America's urbanization ratio, which is a measure of people living in the urban areas. Compared to other regions, Latin America has high urbanization. It rivals that of North America and is expected to grow within the outlook from 80% in 2010 to 85% in 2040. This is important to energy demand because the urban infrastructure creates demands for iron, steel, cement, industrial goods, all of which are energy intensive. We have manufacturing and other industries cluster around the cities. Income levels and standards of living are higher in urban areas, and household size tends to be smaller in urban areas, which leads to a higher number of households. The outlook provides both a supply and demand perspective, and we'll start with the demand side. This chart shows the energy demands in the 4 categories: transportation, residential, commercial, industrial, and power generation. You can see how each category grows through the year of 2040. Just two observations. Note that the transportation, which is in green, is up 40%. This is a prominent sector for most consumers, but not the largest. Also note that the electrical power generation in red, not only is it the largest sector, but it grows the most. So remember that trends for electrical generation are particularly important. Let's look at transportation. So this includes all forms of transportation, not just cars and trucks, which we call heavy duty. Transportation demand grows by 40% through 2040. If we start from the bottom, light duty demand, mostly cars, peaks at 23 million barrels of oil per day, and then it trends down. Energy efficiency improvements make a big impact here, and we'll show you that on a later chart. Heavy duty demand, or trucks, take a top spot by 2030 and make up to 40% of transportation demand through the rest of the outlook. Marine and aviation combined make up 1/3 of the demand growth. Now I'll address, if this is a chart that shows the Latin American transportation demand. As you can see, it is very similar to the other charts that you have. You do see the rollover in the light duty tied to the energy demands. And you can also see the change in the overall fleet. If we look at that in a global view, in the light duty vehicle fleet demand, we'll look at cars. We expect the number of cars to double. That means we'll add 900 million vehicles. Most of those will be in the developed world. China dominates and has reached over 400 million cars by 2040. Now, if we slice this data by looking at two factors, how much of this growth is due to population and how much is due to higher incomes or standard of living, which allow people to buy cars, you can see that overwhelmingly the largest share is from the increased standard of living. This is another example of how economic development drives changes within the energy market. Now on the right, we show the demand for light-duty transportation fuels. Note that the overall picture is quite flat, even as the world is seeing a doubling in the number of cars. This is because of efficiencies, or mileage, of these cars will double. The improving fuel economy is primarily driven by the government mandates. Everyone is curious to know what we think that the car of the future will be. We believe that the hybrid vehicle will become dominant. By full hybrid, we mean a car like the Toyota Prius, which has onboard both a conventional internal combustion engine and an electric motor with a battery. You can think of these cars as the best of both worlds. The performance and range of a conventional engine and the efficiencies of an electric drive. Note also that car manufacturers are under pressure from governments to achieve high efficiency standards, particularly within the developed world. It's going to take cars like the hybrid to achieve these high mileage targets. We do show significant growth in electric cars and plug-in hybrids, but we believe their deployment will be limited because of their higher costs, their range issues, and their practical limitations. You can see we also show some growth in cars fueled by natural gas, but it remains a modest slice. This is because the economics for natural gas are much more attractive for heavy-duty transportation rather than light-duty vehicles. So if we take a look at the heavy-duty transportation, it has the largest increase in absolute demand. It shows it up 65%. This subsector is strongly influenced by the economic growth rates as the movement of goods and freight are closely correlated with economic expansion. This is not complicated. As we make more things, we need to move more things. We see consistent and steady demand increases in the world, even in the OECD countries. Now, if I take this chart and I slice it in a different way, diesel makes up 80% of the growth in the heavy-duty vehicles in the outlook. In red, you can see natural gas emerging here as a significant fuel, rising to a 10% share in 2040. So let's take a look now at energy generation. Looking first at the growth of electrical demand. We expect the world will need 85% more electricity by 2040. If we break down the growth from the chart, note that these base declines, mainly due to continued improvements in efficiencies across all sectors. Industrial demand expansion makes up about 1/2 of the increased power need. Again, we can see significant impacts of higher standards of living, separate from population growth. This growth is evident when we look at the individual countries' forecasts shown on the right. The developing economies are all rising on demand. Most notable is China's sharp electrical demand growth that started about the turn of the century. Its electricity demand has surpassed the US and has reached about 1/2 of the level that is expected by 2040. We see more modest growth in the OECD, as you can see by looking at the US in blue and as well as Europe, that is in green. If we look at Latin America energy demand, on the left we summarize the electrical demand by sector in thousands of terawatt hours. We expect continued growth across all major sectors, with total electrical demand in Latin America increasing by about 3% per year through 2040. This is a 134% increase. Heavy industry experiences the largest growth, with electricity demand in the sector more than doubling over the period. The chart on the right shows the fuels used by the electricity generation sector to generate Latin America's electricity. We expect that most Latin America's growing demand for electricity will be met by less CO2 intensive fuels, such as natural gas, nuclear, and renewables. In Latin America, the share of electricity generation met by natural gas grows from about 25% in 2010 to about 35% in 2040. About the same share that will be held by renewables, including hydro, wind, and solar. Now, as the world needs almost twice as much power generation by the year 2040, for power companies, a key issue is what fuels make the most sense to generate all this power. They have a wide range of factors to consider, as laid out in this chart. Please note that this is not our chart, but rather this is a chart that is from the power industry. EPRI is the premier technical organization for the industry. The major choices are laid out across the top. We have coal with carbon capture, natural gas, nuclear, wind, and solar. The rows show the various performance attributes for each of these. You can see the scale at the bottom, with green being the best and full yellow being the worst. For the sake of time, let's focus on 3 key factors which drive the decision making: economics, the CO2 emissions, and availability. In the public debate regarding energy, too often these factors are considered in isolation, with attention paid only to cost or only to emissions. But practically speaking, decisions such as these are made in combination, not in isolation. Weighing trade-offs is essential to making a workable, viable, and responsible energy decision. On the economics, coal and gas are the clear winners, but in many places, nuclear is not far behind. Nuclear is mostly limited by regulatory and social acceptance, but many countries are still outright banning or shutting down their nuclear plants. For emissions, renewables win hands down, but they're more expensive. So here, the issue is simply how much policymakers are willing to mandate these higher cost sources to reduce emissions, which means higher electricity prices for the consumers. Lastly, availability. Because the wind is not always blowing and the sun is not always shining, renewables have a fundamental change for power companies who are responsible for providing adequate power every second of every day. Wind often needs to be backed up 100%. For example, in Texas, you cannot rely on the wind blowing when we hit our peak air conditioning demand in the summer. Overall, this chart highlights why natural gas is seeing so much growth in the power generation sector. It's much cleaner than coal, it reduces our CO2, it's economical, has relatively low cost, it's easy to build and operate with a great deal of flexibility, and including it's always ready to make power when we need it. So let's look at the electricity generation by region. We show for each major fuel the demand for the year 2040. And in the order from left to right, the dotted line, so I get a dotted line up there. The dotted line shows demand in the 2010 base year. And oil is expected to remain in the #1 position, which will increase about 30%. Oil remains uniquely attractive for transportation, as liquid fuels continue to set the standards for convenience and performance. Let me go back. There we go. That's what we want. All right. I got myself off by a slide. So to continue the power discussion, let's look at the global demand for power. We see global demand to rise by 50%. All of the growth is expected to come from outside of the OECD. The biggest increase will come from China, where the demand for fuel for power generation is expected to nearly double. Strong growth is also seen in India and China, the key growth countries and other developing nations, where we have rising incomes and living standards to result in rising electrical usage. The mix of fuels in each region will vary widely. In the OECD, there will be movement away from coal as a result of CO2 emission policies. In China, we also expect to see a shift away from coal, but not until 2025. While natural gas and renewables are expected to play a role in replacing coal in China, the biggest contribution will come from nuclear. China's nuclear generation is seen expanding significantly over the outlook period, rising about 20 times by 2040. India is expected to continue relying heavily on coal due to economic factors. Natural gas is expected to see strong growth in the key growth countries, such as Iran, Nigeria, Mexico, and Saudi Arabia. In addition, many of the key growth countries, such as Brazil, South Africa, Iran, and Mexico, are expected to expand their existing nuclear capacity through 2040. And we're seeing developing nuclear power capacity for the first time. Now let's look at the global demand. We show for each major fuel the demand that we think will happen by the year 2040. And in an order of size from left to right, the dotted line shows demand in the 2010 base year. And the percent on top of each bar is the average annual growth rate. Oil is expected to remain in the #1 position, increasing by about 30%. Oil remains uniquely attractive for transportation, as liquid fuels continue to set the standards for convenience and performance in terms of energy density, storing large amounts of energy in a small volume. A typical car carries only about 100 pounds of gasoline, yet this can power a 5,000-pound car at 110 kilometers per hour for more than 500 kilometers. Gas has the absolute largest growth, with demand rising 65%, and it surpasses coal in 2025. As we discussed, it's a prime fuel for power generation, and its use is growing in all other demand sectors. Note that the renewables of wind, solar, and biofuels have the fastest growing rate. They are growing faster than fossil fuels, but they still contribute only a small, modest share to the global energy picture. Renewables will continue to be challenged by their high costs and the fact that they cannot produce energy on demand. Given the sheer scale of the energy demand worldwide and the difficulty of achieving rapid transformation in a complex global energy system, the growth rate does not materially alter the energy mix. Now let's look at Latin America specifically. On the left, we show the energy demand in Latin America broken down by country. As you can see, Brazil is the largest contributor to the region's energy demand. By 2040, Brazil will account for over 45% of Latin American energy demand, compared to 40% in 2010. Chile continues strong increases in demand, with average growth rates at 2% per year through 2040. Oil and natural gas will continue to meet most of the energy needs in Latin America during this period. Wind, solar, and biofuels are growing at roughly 5% per year, and they account for over 5% of Latin America's energy demand by 2040. To ensure reliable and affordable energy to meet this evolving demand, we need to expand all economic fuel choices. Technology is going to play a key role as new innovations and improvements continue to advance the potential for all sources of energy. Here we can look at Latin America's residential and commercial sector. As the number of homes and businesses increase in Latin America, the combined residential commercial sector energy demand in this region is going to increase about 55% from 2010 to 2040. Total industrial demand increases by 80%. This growth is occurring across all industrial areas, with heavy industry and chemical industry seeing the largest increases volumetrically. Now let's specifically look at Latin America's energy picture as it relates to natural gas. On the left, we show the overall demand projection for Latin America through 2040, broken down by energy type. As you can see, demand in this region is steadily growing throughout the outlook. Of the major fuels, natural gas is going to be the fastest growing. Let's talk more specifically about increasing demand for gas among various sectors. On the right, we show Latin America's demand for natural gas in BCF, billion cubic feet per day. As you can see, gas demand grows strongly through the outlook period. Natural gas use grows most strongly in the industrial and electrical energy sectors, where volumetric growth in each sector rises by about 10 billion cubic feet per day. Demand for gas in the transportation and residential commercial sectors also show growth, although it is smaller. Let's take a moment to look at our CO2 emissions. As a global society, we need to identify and assess climate risks associated with rising greenhouse gas emissions. Although climate policies remain uncertain today, for purposes of the outlook to 2040, we assume that governments will continue to gradually adopt a wide variety of policies to help stem greenhouse gas emissions. Over time, as these policies advance and people respond to rising energy costs, we anticipate greater adoption of energy-saving technologies and practices, as well as lower CO2 emissions per energy unit consumed. Worldwide energy-related CO2 emissions will plateau around 2030 and then decline through 2040. Regionally, we see a variety of emission patterns through 2040. These reflect the different stages of economic development and varying degrees and types of energy used at a national level. Non-OECD emissions surpassed OECD emissions in 2004, largely due to significant economic progress and a carbon-intensive energy mix dependent heavily on coal. Increasingly, the world's CO2 emissions will be driven by developing nations. Overall, non-OECD emissions are likely to rise about 50%, as energy demand rises by about 2/3. Over the same period, OECD emissions are likely to decline over 20% and approach a 25% of the global emissions, which is down from 40% in 2010. If we look ahead to 2040, we anticipate OECD and non-OECD nations will continue to improve the energy efficiencies of their economies, but also shift towards less carbon-intensive energy sources. Together, these factors will help global CO2 emissions peak around 2030. On a per capita basis, we expect OECD nations will reduce emissions per capita over the outlook, but will remain much higher than the levels in the non-OECD nations. Now, if we turn to another important subject and look at Latin America's CO2 emissions. Here we show energy-related CO2 emissions in millions of metric tons. As the economies of Latin America continue to expand rapidly, emissions in the region are expected to increase across all sectors and fuel types. By 2040, overall CO2 emissions in Latin America are expected to be almost 70% higher than they were in 2040. We're now done with the demand side of the outlook. The other part of the equation is to look at the supply. This chart shows the growing contributions from non-traditional supplies enabled by technologies. Of these expanding supplies, natural gas liquids in red make up one of the largest supply increases, and it's driven by unconventional development. Deep water continues to grow and is up about 6 million barrels per day. Tight oil increases to over 8 million barrels a day, while oil sands grow almost 7 million barrels per day over the outlook. Let's look again at the bottom, the dark green crude. One element that we want to highlight this year is that the decline of conventional sources will require significant additional development. People outside of our industry do not always appreciate how much investment is required just to offset the natural decline from conventional oil fields. In order to sustain healthy market supplies, it's critical for the industry to continue to make large, ongoing investments. Another question we often get is, how many years of oil supply does the world have? This chart shows how that estimate has changed over time. Even since only the year 2000, estimates of total resources have more than doubled. This, of course, is a technology story. As we discover new ways to find oil and produce resources, the estimates continue to grow. The value of the new technologies in terms of these added energy supplies amounts to trillions of dollars for world economies. If you do the math on this most recent estimate, it means it amounts to well over 100 years of supply. Here, we'll build up the balance for one region, North America. I'll show you the rest of the world in a minute. The lines at the top are the demand for each year. First, we add conventional developments and deep water. By adding oil sands, tight oil, and natural gas liquids, we see that the gap is closing in the later years. With the addition of other liquids, including biofuels, we see total supply exceeds demand, making North America a net exporter by 2020. Biofuels are expected to remain limited, driven only by government mandates. Now let's turn to the rest of the regions. For Latin America, we expect supplies will grow with the expansion of deep water and unconventionals, supporting exports. Africa benefits from deep water and conventional developments. However, increasingly they need more of this oil to meet their own growing demands, and this means that exports will decline over time. Europe remains an importer as well as an area with shrinking supplies. Both the Russian, Caspian, and Middle East regions continue to be exporters, where decline of conventional developments will require major ongoing investments. Finally, Asia Pacific. While regional supplies remain fairly stable, demand continues to expand significantly, requiring a high level of imports. China's import dependency rises to about 80% by the second half of the outlook, versus 52% in 2010. Let's look at gas. In terms of regional trends in natural gas, the two biggest changes will come from North America and Asia Pacific. In North America, the story is increasing supply. Because of the growth of the unconventional production, North America is expected to surpass Russia-Caspian as the largest gas-producing region around 2020. North America unconventional gas production is expected to nearly triple over the outlook period, enabling the region to emerge as a significant supplier of natural gas exports. In Asia Pacific, the story is rising demand. Asia-Pacific gas production is expected to double from 2010 to 2040, in part due to the application of unconventional technologies. But its demand is going to grow even faster, rising 170%. As a result, Asia-Pacific region will get an increased share of natural gas demand from imports and is expected to surpass Europe as the world's largest natural gas importer. If we look at the other regions, Europe will need to import an even greater share of its gas as local production declines. The Russian Caspian region is expected to increase its gas production by 40%, with almost all of that growth growing towards exports. The Middle East gas production is expected to rise by 75% from 2010 to 2040, which is about the same rate as local demand. Through 2040, the majority of natural gas imports will come from LNG. Global LNG trade is expected to more than triple, reaching nearly 100 billion cubic feet per day by 2040. LNG will play a particularly important role in meeting that demand in Asia Pacific. Even in regions expected to have a net surplus of gas, some, such as Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, will still import some LNG. The fact that several regions are both importers and exporters of natural gas highlights the importance of trade in optimizing energy flows in a global marketplace. So natural gas will continue to play an increasingly important role in meeting global energy needs. Utilities, industries, and other consumers are choosing this fuel because it's widely available, versatile, and produces relatively low emissions. Natural gas will be the fastest growing major energy supplier through 2040. Natural gas resources are geographically diverse. Production to 2040 will reflect this diversity with strong growth in most regions. In 2010, conventional gas production met more than 85% of the global gas demand. But unconventional gas resources, which are unlocked by technology, a combination of both horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, are playing an important and increasing role in meeting demand. By 2040, about 35% of gas supply is expected to be from unconventional sources. On the right, we show how unconventional production is broken down by type. Unconventional gas is split into tight gas, coal bed methane, and shale gas. In 2010, shale gas, like that found in the Barnett and the Marcellus in the US, makes up about 30% of unconventional production, but is expected to increase to about 60% of production in 2040 globally. Trade has always played an important role in meeting the world's energy needs. With free trade, energy can move between importing and exporting nations in the most efficient way, and at the lowest cost. If energy is the lifeblood of the world economy, then free trade is a circulatory system that keeps things flowing in a healthy way. As mentioned earlier, the Middle East and Russian Caspian regions are expected to remain the world's largest energy exporters, while Asia Pacific and Europe remain the largest importers. It's important to note that even regions that are fairly well balanced may have significant imports and exports of energy to optimize their own energy systems. Over the past century, oil has become the most actively traded form of energy. Today, about half of the world's oil demand is met from imports and exports. The other half is from local production. That percentage is expected to remain roughly the same through volumes of oil traded internationally will continue to grow. Trading in natural gas is expected to expand rapidly, mostly due to projected growth in liquefied natural gas. Global LNG trading is expected to more than triple over that outlook period, rising to 100 BCF per day in 2040. Much of this growth will serve rapidly expanding markets in Asia. By 2040, more than 25% of the world's natural gas demand will be met by LNG shipments or interregional pipeline trade, compared to 15% in 2010. As the outlook for energy shows, demand for energy continues to be driven by two things. people, and progress. While progress during the last century was centered in the OECD, today's growth is being led by non-OECD economies. China already has made great strides. Others, such as India and the 10 key growth countries, are in relatively early stages of development. From 2010 to 2040, billions of people in these emerging markets are expected to rise in the middle class, propelling a nearly 70% rise in their energy demand. The OECD energy demand, on the other hand, is falling. By 2040, non-OECD countries will account for more than 70% of global energy demand. China alone is going to account for more than 20%, or about twice of Europe's share. This chart gives some perspective of how the world's energy demand continues to evolve because it allows us to look 3 decades in both directions from our baseline year of 2010. In 1980, the demand for energy was under 300 quads, and in 3 decades, it grew by about 80%. This is in stark contrast to our future projections that show energy demand only growing 35% in the next 3 decades. So even though the global economy will grow more than it did between 1980 and 2010, we see less energy. It is also interesting to look at the transitions of fuel over time. Today into the future, we continue to see global energy sources grow more diverse. Oil and natural gas grow to about 60% of the world's energy, reflecting their importance to global development. The big story here is technology. Innovation, both on the supply and on the demand side, over many decades, has driven significant improvements in the energy picture. For the long term, it is difficult to know exactly which technologies will make significant contributions. But we can be sure that technologies will continue to improve, sometimes incrementally, and sometimes in big steps forward. Given society's strong track record in science and technology advancements, we have every reason to be optimistic for the future. To wrap things up, I have 3 points I'd like to emphasize. First, the improvements in the living standards worldwide is a key to drivers of global growing demand, and it's a good news story. The world will continue to need huge volumes of energy to underpin our modern way of life. And 3, technology always has been, and surely will be, the greatest source of improvements in the way we produce energy and the way we use energy. If people are looking for more information, there is information on the Exxon website, as well as there is an iPad application that you can download, and it has even more detail than this. Thank you.